Je vais commencer par une illustration de ce que j'aimerais vous raconter. Et je vous raconterai ça en français avant de passer à mon exposé en anglais. C'est ce qui s'est passé il y a 12 ans lorsque quand j'ai quitté Bruxelles, où j'avais fini ma thèse de doctorat et où je suis parti pour Birkbeck College. Et où j'estimais que mes connaissances d'anglais étaient suffisantes pour fonctionner dans un environnement académique anglais, puisque je me disais que j'étais capable de comprendre le journal télévisé et la radio, et que je comprenais les journaux et tout, donc ça ne devait pas poser un grand problème. Et puis, j'ai perdu cette illusion assez rapidement. Le premier staff meeting, je me suis rendu compte qu'en fait, tout le monde, je comprenais tous les mots, et je ne comprenais absolument pas ce qui se disait vraiment. Et donc, j'avais l'impression que tout le monde était poli, gentil, s'entendait bien, parce que, contrairement à Bruxelles, personne ne frappait du poing sur la table pour souligner qu'il n'était pas d'accord. Il n'y a personne qui quittait la salle de réunion en claquant la porte et en criant que vous étiez tous des idiots. Enfin, des choses que, je ne veux pas dire que ça se passait tous les jours à Bruxelles, mais disons que c'était pas inhabituel que des voix soient levées et tout et tout. Alors que mes chers collègues du département français, ils restaient très stiff upper lipped, vraiment. Et j'arrivais pas à lire entre les stiff upper lips. Et donc, je me disais que c'était magnifique, vraiment. Et puis, on m'avait demandé on a un test d'admission, il fallait que ça soit un peu modernisé. Et on m'avait demandé de m'occuper de ça. Donc, j'avais présenté quelque chose qui était informatisé. Et puis, on discute de ça à la prochaine réunion. Et les collègues qui disent « Excellent proposal, excellent idea ». Et je me dis, bon, super, c'est réglé. Et puis, et alors, est-ce qu'on l'adopte? Oh non. Oh. Ah bon? Donc là, après ça, en fait, je suis passé par une période silencieuse. En fait, je n'ai plus rien dit à des staff meetings pendant 1 an et demi. Et puis, quand j'ai commencé à m'exprimer, je l'ai fait en français pour être certain qu'on interprète correctement ce que je voulais dire. Et donc, c'est ça, ce final lap auquel je fais allusion. On peut avoir à un certain moment l'illusion qu'on parle une langue étrangère, et puis ce n'est que dans le contexte de l'interaction qu'on se rend compte en fait qu'on est gravement handicapé et qu'il y a plein de choses qui vous échappent, et c'est assez inquiétant. Une deuxième anecdote, c'est que ce final lap, ça peut en fait aussi tout d'un coup arriver dans votre langue maternelle si vous ne l'utilisez pas pendant un certain temps. Et je parlerai là, et que ce sont en fait des choses qui se passent imperceptiblement. Et je ferai allusion là à une ancienne étudiante à moi, une égyptienne qui vivait déjà depuis 15 ans à Londres, qui rentrait régulièrement au Caire, d'où elle était originaire, et qui, au Caire, en sortant de la maison d'une amie dans un quartier populaire, descend l'escalier, et voit une troupe de jeunes filles d'école en uniforme s'approcher et la regarder, et l'une qui dit aux autres « Ah, regardez donc cette étrangère !» Elle était choquée parce que là, tout ce que les filles avaient vu, c'était elle qui descendait les escaliers. Alors elle dit « Comment est-ce que… » Et donc elle se tourne vers elle, et dans le dialecte local et assez vulgaire, elle crie « Non, mais ça va pas !» Et les filles se regardent et se mettent à rire et disent « Ah, et elle parle arabe, l'étrangère !» Alors là, de nouveau, c'est donc qu'est-ce qu'on perd sans se rendre compte. Et puis je me rends compte que aussi, comme Belge, il semble qu'au début à Birkbeck, je serrais trop les mains, ça se fait pas, que j'étais trop près de mes collègues quand je leur parlais, et ça non plus, on n'aime pas, il faut une certaine distance. Ce sont des choses que inconsciemment on adopte, et donc quand je rentre en Belgique, il y a mes amis qui disent « Ah, on ne fait plus la bise !» Ah oui, en effet, il faut faire la bise. Et alors, peut-être qu'ils trouvent que je suis devenu froid, distant et trop british, alors que évidemment, pour les british, je ne serai absolument jamais british, je suis clairement toujours European, c'est-à-dire pas eux, et puis un belge. Alors, je vous présenterai quelques définitions, le background. Ah, ben non, là, il faut que je passe en anglais. So I will present some definitions on the background of my research. I will present my dependent variables, grammaticized concepts, lexicalized concepts, motion scripts. I will talk about my independent variable, which here is authentic language use during acquisition and regular use of LX, which means any foreign language after the first language in a multicultural environment. I'm talking about the L2 user, which is any person who knows and uses a second language at any level, so you don't have to be near native to be called a L2 user. And it's Viv Cook who defends this notion that you can be perfectly legitimate even though your accent is non-native and you make occasional grammatical or lexical errors. The final step might also be, in neurolinguistic terms, the increased development of implicit language system through exposure to language interaction, and that is Michel Paradis in his latest book on the neurolinguistics of bilingualism, and you have the reference on the reference list there. Also the realization that intercultural communication is not always as easy in a second language compared to a first language, and that you may go through gradual conscious or unconscious conceptual change, and I think that non-verbal things like distance or shaking hands or smiling or even topics of conversation might be part of that conceptual change. So I think there is a kind of an ever-receding horizon. You always think that you finally reached the point where you are a fluent L2 or LX user, and it seems that there is always a hill behind the one where you're standing on. And so if you're a beginning learner, you think, right, if I know enough words, then I'll get there, right? Then you get to the intermediate level and you think, okay, well, maybe once I will finally understand what règle du participe passé is in French, then I will really be a smooth user of French. And then you realize, man, there are other things that seem to escape me. Social linguistic competence. Why don't I understand these argot words? Why does the teacher seem dissatisfied when I use a word like con? And he should congratulate me, right? I learned these new words, and yet somehow it doesn't seem to impress him very much. And that's where you start to get a glimpse of the final lap, everything that lies beyond social linguistics, social pragmatic, social cultural competence. And why is it so hard to acquire these competences? Well, it's because it's not easily taught in a few simple rules. There are rules, but there are usually rules of thumb, and you have to find out for yourself how it works in true interaction. Why? Well, because the teacher usually does not yell at his students. The teacher usually does not use argot with students. So the range of registers in a classroom is always much more limited than in true interactions. So teachers tend to use formal registers, and the books that students use tend to reflect oral language in a very particular way, and Astrid Berrier referred to this at the conference, and Raymond Moujon also looked at handbooks used in Toronto for the teaching of French, where, for example, there is almost no omission of ne in oral speech, and when there is, it's only the bad guys who use the omission. So you create complete false representations of reality. And then there is the reality check, when suddenly the foreign language user leaves the classroom, goes to the country, spends some time there, and discovers that he or she is unable to function as expected in that new environment. And Gemma, which is one of our participants, and I will talk more about it in a second, went to Germany, felt that she had lost her identity, she was slow to understand, she could not make any jokes, she felt alienated, painfully frustrated, became very depressed, but by the end of the year she had picked up sufficient social cultural, social pragmatic competence, and she was able to express herself with more wittiness, and she was able to make jokes, and she felt better about it. And I'm sure we have all experienced that, and I fear that many of our French colleagues don't show up at international conferences, for exactly that reason, that they are fearful that their accent may be laughed at, and that is probably a completely wrong supposition, because there are, as you know, there are no more tolerant people in the world than applied linguists. I mean, we love different accents, we love diversity, so please come to international conferences and don't be afraid of using to speak English. So one of the difficulties is how to internalize speech routines, speech acts, how to choose appropriate topics in conversation, how to adopt the proper conversation style, and I would refer here to the excellent work of Christine Dewaele and Bert Peters. Little innocent things like "ça va," how do you answer when someone tells you "ça va" or "how are you?" In English, are you supposed to give a proper answer or not? It takes a while before you realize what the script is and what is expected of you. Then also Dewaele and Peters, who talk about French conversational style, who's perceived to be more direct and more aggressive, more engaged than English style, so it can create false impressions. I mean, the British tend to think that the French, well, I mean, they love things about the French, but they think that they are usually too aggressive, and that is probably the consequence of these different conversation styles. And the other interesting thing, and that's something that Bert Peters said, les normes communicatives et valeurs culturelles des interlocuteurs restent largement inconscientes. So one of the questions I would ask you is, if you are engaged in language teaching, in how far can these unconscious rules make conscious? In how far is it useful to point students to the fact that the French tend to be a bit more direct, can be perceived as more aggressive, and then try and imagine scenarios or scripts where they are more aggressive in English, and then how an English speaker would do for similar speech acts in similar situations. I think those would be interesting exercises, and I think it's important to draw people's attention to this. Then, I don't know whether you know Nancy Houston, Canadian author, lives in Paris, and who talks about l'asymétrie lexicale. En ce qui me concerne, c'est en français que je me sens à l'aise dans une conversation intellectuelle. Interview, colloque, situation linguistique faisant appel aux concepts, aux catégories apprises à l'âge adulte. Si j'ai envie de délirer, me défouler, jurer, chanter, gueuler, me laisser aller au pur plaisir de la parole, c'est en anglais que je le fais. And that's one of the things I'm really interested in, is why this first language somehow seems more direct, more powerful than a language learned at adult age. So I would say that although I'm probably dominant in English for English writing, because I write more in English than in French, I would hit my foot and I would say, ah, merde, and I wouldn't think of using an English word there. So there are some languages that somehow stay closer to your heart, and that's an interesting topic of investigation. It's also about the topic. What do you talk about? And I don't know whether you know the work of Celeste Kinginger at Penn State University in the States, who studied the case of Alice, American working class student who spent a year in X, and who just could not stand the political discussions. So she had a friend, Cédric, who always wanted to discuss politics with her. She didn't want to talk about politics. Most of the young Americans hate politics. They don't want to know anything about it. They don't feel responsible for their president. They don't feel responsible for the foreign policy of their country. And so they don't want to be, you know, drawn into these endless discussions about the wrong and rights of President Bush. So it's also an identity issue. Maybe they don't want to conform to this very French thing, which is let's sit and have a glass of wine and talk about politics. Maybe they want to sit and have a glass and talk about anything but politics. So non-native speakers face conceptual challenges, and one of them is the fact that they have incomplete conceptual representations of scripts, of emotion words, that they often also lack the metaphors and figures of speech that allow people to convey subtle meaning and they have to be too explicit and too heavy-footed, and so it's obviously something really difficult to use idioms and proverbs and metaphors appropriately. So conceptual categories or concepts, and I used the definition by my friend and colleague Anita Pavlenko from Temple University in Philadelphia, who defines them as mental representations that affect individuals' immediate perception, attention, and recall, allow members of specific language and cultural groups to conduct identification, comprehension, inferencing, categorization along similar lines. And those conceptual categories are something that was relatively under-researched in the literature. And one of the most famous models on the bilingual lexicon is the revised hierarchical model by Kroll and Stewart, where you see that, I don't know whether you know this model, the idea is that you don't have direct links between your L2 words and L2 concepts. You start by building a link between your L2 words and the L1 word, and from the L1 word, the link to the concept. And only later in acquisition do you develop direct links between L2 words and concepts in the L2. The thing is that Kroll and Stewart, as you see, have only one box for concepts, so they don't differentiate between L1 or L2 concepts. And what Anita Pavlenko proposes is a revised version of the revised model, which she calls the modified hierarchical model. And the idea is that, in fact, you build, so you start out with L1 mediated categories, and then you gradually develop L2 categories, and these can be slightly overlapping with the L1 concepts. And so there will be interaction between the concepts in your L1 and L2, and it is something that I will demonstrate in a moment. So that is, in fact, my theoretical background. So we have conceptual variation and change in emotion concepts in bilinguals. The fact is that emotion concepts vary between languages, and we already talked here about amai in Japanese, which is really hard to translate in another language. And so these concepts, they vary. They can be distinct in respective languages. They can also be distinct from those of monolingual speakers. If you are a bilingual speaker, obviously the fact that you will have an effect of the concepts of the other language that have an effect on your first language, just as my Egyptian student, just by walking down the stairs, showed that she was no longer a local person. The other important thing is the idea of the script. It's not enough to know the words, you have to know in what kind of discourse these words need to be embedded. So the definition by Schenk and Abelson, it's a structure that describes appropriate sequences of events in a particular context, made up of slots and requirements about what can fill those slots. The structure is an interconnected whole, and what is in one slot affects what can be in another. Script handle stylized everyday situations, so it's predetermined stereotyped sequence of actions. So it also means that you have to use the right opening of the script for the person you are talking to understand what script you are engaging in, right? Because sometimes if you are a non-native speaker, it can take a while before the person realizes, aha, that person is actually apologizing. I didn't recognize it from the start, right? Because the person is not using the standard script for apology or any other speech act. To give you an idea about conceptual structure, we have chairs, and the idea is that there are prototypical examples of chairs, and then members of the category that are more at the periphery. So you would the ones on the left are typically chairs, the one in the middle probably also a typical chair. The one on the right is clearly more on the periphery. So language-mediated concepts, we have lexicalized and grammaticalized concepts. The lexicalized ones entail lexical encoding of natural objects, artifacts, substances, events, actions, while grammatical concepts are more for syntactically encoded notions, and Slobin talks about number, gender, tense, aspect, but you could also talk about pronouns of address, for example, and that's the example I will present to you. It's doubly hard if you're an emotional multilingual, and I discovered in Spain that although my Spanish is quite okay, especially after a couple of days there, that I had incredible difficulty in getting angry appropriately in Spanish. I was very fearful that I would be using words that were too strong and that I would end up in jail instead of expressing my anger and obtaining what I wanted, which was a compensation because I had missed a flight because of someone's error. I didn't have the right ticket, and so I was very angry, but I wanted another ticket. I didn't want jail. And I realized, right, I'm becoming angry in Spanish. I explain it in Spanish, and then I realized, right, I'm not going to win this, because you want to win the argument. So I switched to English, which was the interlocutor's foreign language too, so I thought, right, I can do this in English, and there I managed to not to end up in jail and get another ticket. So it's something that is obviously also hard to teach in a classroom. Can you teach that in a classroom? How to get angry appropriately? How, because the worst thing that you can learn in a, well, what you do learn in these handbooks are, Monsieur, la soupe est froide, and that's about as far as you go in conflict management, right? Non, monsieur, on vous apportera, on va vous la réchauffer, blah, blah. Okay, so the difficulty about exolinguals getting angry is that they have to do a lot of controlled processing. They have to search for the right word. They have to think about, right, what's the gender of this word. They have to think about grammar rules, pragmatic rules, idioms, metaphors. They have so many things to think about that they just cannot channel the strength of their emotion into that particular language channel, which is why you prefer to do it in your first language. You don't have to worry about all that grammatical and pragmatic stuff that comes to you automatically. Choice of pronoun, which is a hard conceptual nut. And Eva Havu yesterday presented an excellent talk on the fact that in Italian and French, there is, although the two systems have relatively similar distinctions between informal, formal forms of the pronoun, yet the system is not totally isomorphic. There are some differences, and that means that, in fact, for an Italian or a French to learn the other language, it makes it quite difficult, because you assume that, the same distinction exists as in my native language. You assume that everything else will be the same, and then you discover that, in fact, it's not the case. And I did some work on this using corpora and also using self-reports, and where students had to interview each other, and there were native speakers, non-native speakers. They were my students at Berwick. I discovered that the native speakers in that particular situation used to much more frequently than the non-native speakers, and also that non-native speakers who had a system with multiple pronouns in their first language typically also used more to. So the fact that you know other languages, or that in your first language you have a similar concepts, apparently has an effect on the use of to in French. And then the native speakers in self-report always used to with people they knew, almost never with people they didn't know. And the non-native speakers were quite close, but not as systematic. And non-native speakers would occasionally, well, they reported that they would occasionally use a to with someone they didn't know, and that's something that native speakers would totally avoid. So this is the different proportion, as you say, in this mutual interview situation where the native speakers used to in more than 90% of the cases, while it was about 55% for the non-native speakers. And this shows you the difference between those who had multiple or only a single pronoun in their first language. The other interesting thing is, if you ask people, native speakers, non-native speakers, about their perception of the difficulty of the choice of pronoun in French, you get, as expected, non-native speakers saying that they tend to find it more difficult than native speakers, although you will be interested to see that many native speakers find that it is, well, some find assez difficile, the biggest proportion found assez facile, right? And then facile, très facile. And the other interesting thing is that among the non-native speakers, those who had stayed or used French most found in fact that the system was more difficult than those who had stayed quite long, but not quite long enough to understand that there is more difficulty beyond this. And this category 4 were typically, they were assistants and graduate students at Paris Nanterre. So they were working in the French academic system. They were Spanish, Finnish, Swedish, and they found that in fact these uses, and I guess that the environment also contributes to it. I mean, people like Colette Noyau, you have to address them properly, right? So I'm sure that they had been told off at some point, and so that they, as a consequence, thought that le vouvoiement in French is, in the end, more difficult than we thought it was. And there again, we discovered an effect of the L1 with multiple pronouns, namely that those with more pronouns in their L1 thought the French system was more difficult. Then with Martine Fahaco, we used DCTs, discourse completion tests, with native speakers, non-native speakers. We coded the use of pronoun or non-use of pronoun in the feedback. So there were situations like you're in the cinema, the person next to you is eating popcorn very loudly. What do you do? So how do you complain? And as you see here, we have the distribution of responses, and you see that non-native speakers tend to use vous more frequently. The non-native speakers tend to use vous more frequently than the native speakers. And you also see that the native speakers are divided on what to use. And that the typical thing is that this shifting between tu and vous, and it's something we discussed yesterday also, it's quite typical for the non-native speakers, it's untypical for native speakers. Native speakers choose a pronoun and stick to the same pronoun. They don't hesitate as much. And you see also that those who were more highly socialized, who were more proficient and who had longer levels of instruction tended to approximate the native speaker norms. And we have the same pattern here about complaining to a friend who damaged a book, where the native speakers would use tu more than the non-native speakers. And also asking for directions, where native speakers would almost always use vous, whereas the non-native speakers have more that use more other options. And you see that the highly socialized non-native speakers tend again to use vous more frequently. So we found significant differences between native and non-native speakers in 5 out of 15 situations. So it means that in many situations there was perfect agreement between native speakers and non-native speakers, only in 5 situations, and typically the situations that were potentially more emotional or more confrontational. There was more worry about the choice of the right pronoun. So it reinforces my point that if you are emotional, everything becomes more difficult, and you tend to make more mistakes or choose inappropriate variants. Then let me talk a little bit about Pavlenko 2007. She had narrative elicitation tasks with monolingual native speakers of Russian, English, bilinguals, and she looked at conceptual equivalence relationships, situations where the L1 and L2 translation equivalents were conceptually perfectly equivalent, those where there was partial overlap, and then conceptual non-equivalence where a language like Japanese Amai would have no equivalent in the second language. I don't know whether the Russian speaker is still here. Anyone knows Russian? There was you are the Russian speaker. So this is, can you read the Russian word? Rastroy.
Pardon?
Tu peux lire ça en russe?
Je peux, mais je parle pas anglais.
Non, mais tu peux le dire en russe.
Ah, en russe?
Oui.
Rastroyenaya.
Voilà. Je ne vais pas le faire comme ça. Voilà. Apparently, there is perfect equivalence with the English concept being upset. It's what my Russian friend Anita tells me. Then there are things where there is absolutely none equivalence. It's the word privacy, a very Anglo-Saxon concept. It doesn't exist in Russian, right? C'est vrai? Ça n'existe pas en russe. Voilà. And so what she discovered, Aneta, is that when you ask, she asked her students of English in St. Petersburg who had never been to outside Russia. They knew the word privacy, they had a semantic representation of it, but they had no conceptual understanding of it. So it meant that although they knew the word, they had in fact no idea what it really meant. And when they were shown a film where there was a clear invasion of privacy, where all the Americans said, oh, invasion of privacy, and the word was used, the Russians did not use, the Russian students did not use that word, did not refer to that concept, but the Russian immigrants in the United States had picked up the social, cultural, social, pragmatic competence and did say, oh, this is invasion of privacy. So not only did they know the word, they also had learned the concept. Then non-equivalence, English-Russian, the English word frustration. Tu me lis ça en russe?
Tout ça?
Ben oui, c'est exotique.
Alors, frustration, чувство неудовлетворения, смешанное с досадой, которое возникает после больших ожиданий.
Voilà. La traduction en anglais, non, ça il ne faut pas lire. Mais apparemment, no, I have to switch back to English. It's something that the bilinguals, the Russian immigrants in the state, use frustratsky because they want to use that word, that very English concept, when they use Russian with their friends.
On peut dire en russe frustration.
Ah.
Ça existe, mais c'est une calque. C'est une calque.
Okay, c'est une calque. Okay, yeah. So you see that concepts do travel between languages, but it takes a while before they grab. Well, they become more widespread. And this is another one, Pirejevat?
Pirejevat.
Ah, okay. And the English translation is to worry, to experience something keenly, suffer things through. So when you see the pictures, it seems quite bad. Apparently so bad that no one else in the world suffers things as badly as the Russians. Right? C'est exclusivement russe. Pirejevat. Voilà. Ça et la vodka. And it's completely absent in the speech of advanced English-Russian bilinguals. So although they learn the word, but they never use it because the concept is foreign to them. No American ever suffers as much as the average Russian. So we have L1 mediated concepts in L2 performance, frustration, avoidance, internalization. Then L2 mediated concepts in L1 performance, namely privacy in the Russian of Russian immigrants in the States, and avoidance of a concept when speaking the L1, namely these late Russian English bilinguals. Then there are other words like cariño in Spanish, which is very hard to translate in English, and Janet Altariba does interesting work on this. So where cariño has a partial overlap with liking, but it's not exactly that. And it's quite difficult, in fact, to teach these words correctly because you have to paraphrase a lot, and people tend to remember only the part that corresponds to a word in their own first language. Then here we have grammaticized emotion concepts, and In English, when you talk about emotion, you typically use adjectives. You present emotion as a state, whereas in Russian, apparently, emotions are much more presented as something dynamic through verbs rather than through adjectives. There are processes, and so when you look at the performance in L1 Russian, and you compare that with L1 English, you see that in L1 Russian, very few adjectives, while there are many used in L1 English. And the learners of the second language do learn these patterns, although it takes them a while before they get to native-like distributions. So there is L1 transfer of adjectival pattern in L2 Russian of American learners of Russian, and L2 transfer of this pattern in the L1 Russian of Russian-English bilinguals. Then I had been working quite a lot on anger, on swearing, and I thought that I would be perceived as a grumpy, angry Belgian researcher in London, and I thought it would be useful to talk more about positive feelings, so emotions of love. And here, Kundera, en français vous écrit, veuillez agréer, cher monsieur, l'assurance de mes sentiments distingués. Kundera receives this letter. De joie, j'ai sauté au plafond. À Paris, il y a une femme qui m'aime, elle a réussi dans les dernières lignes d'une lettre officielle à glisser une déclaration d'amour. Non seulement elle éprouve pour moi des sentiments, mais elle souligne expressément qu'ils sont distingués. Jamais une Tchèque ne m'a rien dit de pareil. Donc, an interesting misunderstanding of a declaration of love, very embarrassing. Bien plus tard, quand je me suis installé à Paris, on m'a expliqué que la pratique épistolaire offre tout un éventail sémantique de formules de politesse, permettent à un Français de choisir avec une précision de pharmacien le sentiment qu'il veut, sans l'éprouver, exprimé au destinataire. Dans ce très large choix, les sentiments distingués représentent le plus bas degré de la politesse administrative, confinant presque au mépris. So it is quite a wake-up when you first think that you are loved, and then it turns out that in fact they don't respect you very much. There is also interesting non-equivalence between these formulas in different cultures, and typically when between Western and Eastern cultures. And this very interesting observation by Veronica Zingdao-Ye, who immigrated to Australia. I don't know whether you've heard of her.
I've heard of her.
You have. You've never met her.
I don't think so.
I have met her once or twice. And she found it quite difficult to use all these I love yous in English, and these terms of endearment and gestures. And so she writes, I fundamentally remain deeply Chinese. My sense of self is Chinese, and I feel most at home when I can express myself, especially my feelings and emotions, in a Chinese way, subtle, implicit, without words. So they typically complain that Westerners use too many words for affection. Then a little bit about the research I did, and I will present to you with Aneta Pavlenko. We used a web questionnaire with 34 questions relating to bilingualism emotion. We collected information about the background of the participants. We had open and closed questions on linguistic behavior, affect, emotion in different languages. As you see, we had about 1,500 participants with a huge background of first languages, also people with many languages, and also highly educated people, so I'm not claiming this is an average representation of the general population. And one of the questions was the sentence, I love you, does it have the same emotional weight in your different languages, and in what language does it feel stronger? And I coded the answers because there were open questions, 3 categories, stronger in the L1, equally strong in the L1, but also in another language, or stronger in the other language. Then my independent variable here is context of acquisition. How was the language learned? Was it learned only through classroom interaction? Was it used through classroom learning, but also authentic use of the language during the learning? Or was it only through naturalistic learning, meaning no classroom instruction whatsoever? And this was the answer. of these 1,500 multilinguals, 45% felt that I love you was stronger in their L1, and 30% in the L1 and some other language, and 25% it had become stronger in another language. This in itself is interesting because it means that these terms of endearment can become stronger in another language. Typically people who said, well, I moved to Spain, I fell in love with a Spaniard, and so our language is Spanish. So for me, te quiero or te amo is stronger than the equivalent in my L1. And then some Japanese participants who said, oh, I love you does not exist in Japanese. And I wonder, how do these Japanese ever declare love? How do they get to have children? So there are translations. Well, maybe you skip the words and you go straight to the act, which I don't know. No, I don't want to insult our Japanese friends. That person says, the feeling is there, where would we have to say it, right? It seems that you have a doubt in love if you say it. I even heard that in English the word does not move me. Even if I heard that in English it does not move me. It sounds sweet, but it's just a word. So it's not a true feeling. And then another Japanese who said, well, we avoid talking about emotions directly, right? Silence is beautiful in Japanese society. Okay. We try to read an atmosphere. In contrast, in the case of English, direct expressions have been regarded as logical thinking. In order to reduce misapprehensions, I try to use clear expression. As a result, I never say, I love you. Maybe that was a particular Japanese person that had a psychological problem. I don't know. So the thing is that you have to be very careful. These are just illustrations so that person hates I love you in any language. And here we see that there was a significant effect for context of acquisition. If you learned a language only through classroom instruction, that the expression I love you did not seem to be just as strong as those who learned a language in a naturalistic way or typically in a mixed environment. So you have probably to fall in love and use the language really. Repeating it to the teacher is not enough for you, unless you're in love with the teacher, to feel how powerful that expression is. So, same approach for the expression of anger. What language do you choose to get angry in 5 different situations? And the answer again, as you see, typically more in English. People prefer to get angry in their L1. In their L1. Could be any language. L2 is also used relatively frequently. L3, L4, L5 are not used very frequently. And 2 Japanese researchers who point out that it is really hard to learn to be rude in a classroom context, right? How it's extremely sensitive. There is a danger of potential misunderstandings. You don't want the parents of your students to turn up and complain that you use rude words in the classroom and that you told them expressions of emotion while it should be better to teach them les règles du participe passé. And we had our colleague Roy Hopkins, who also focused on this non-verbal expression of anger, which is again something quite hard to read, and so it's quite difficult if you cannot read the emotional state of your interlocutor. Is that person actually angry or joking or whatever? Context of acquisition has again a very strong effect in the different languages and the different situations. And as you see, those who learn the language only in classroom typically did not use that language as frequently to express anger in, compared to those who learned their language in a mixed or naturalistic environment. Then here we have a Fleming, Bart, and he complains about the fact that he finds it difficult to be moderately angry and annoyed in French. He says, yeah, I learned the grammar, but how can I find the right tone to express my anger? I'm concentrating too much on French grammar and vocabulary. and obviously I don't have to do that in Dutch, and that's exactly the kind of problem you have. You cannot express an emotion fully if you have to think about gender and tense and aspect and articles and stuff. And this is another interesting phenomenon in intercultural communication within the couple. If you're married to someone who doesn't speak your first language and you are really angry at your partner, and although your partner does not understand your first language, you do swear at your partner in your own first language, and he or she will get the message. And then here we have Chinese from Hong Kong, who confirms the general trend there that expression of emotion is usually suppressed. So she uses another language to express feelings in, and so she remembers the time where she was arguing with her parents, and that's her writing it. I was so angry that I shouted out, "It's unfair!" in English. I guess it's regarded quite impolite if I shouted at my parents, but at that point I feel I had to express my anger and let myself just do it in another language. Maybe I feel I'm another person if I say that in English. And there was another a Chinese professor, mid-50s, also Hong Kong, who said, "Oh, I could never swear in Mandarin or Cantonese, but I can do so easily in English." So you escape the social convention by using the other language, and that is perfectly appropriate and acceptable, but you cannot do it in your first language. So it's like a kind of an escape valve. Then swearing and taboo words, do they have the same weight in different languages? And again, you find the same pattern as for the expression of anger, namely that you typically feel that swear words in your L1 are stronger than in languages you have learned later, and it goes down for languages you have learned later and later. And we have the same effect of context of acquisition. Those who have learned language only through classroom instruction, they don't feel that these swear words are as powerful as those who learn it in a mixed or naturalistic way. And there are also interesting cultural differences in anger script. So between German and Italian, right? If I'm really angry, only German and one words come to mind. If I use Italian, I might not use the right measure. Swearing in Italian means talking about God, Maria, etc., in an obscene way. It doesn't mean a thing in German. In German, you use animal names, right? So it would be completely absurd if you were Italian and you started swearing with German words about religion. It wouldn't work, right? So you have to know the cultural script. So what does it mean? That different conceptual equivalent relationships involve different learning tasks, different levels of difficulty, different distinct errors. So we may have to teach these things distinctly. We need to use LX in authentic situations. Emotion scripts may also be avoided because they may be there, but maybe you just cannot access them because you are too emotional, which is kind of paradoxical. About these learning tasks, it would probably be good to point to students where there is equivalence, where there is non-equivalence or partial non-equivalence, and give examples and talk about this. And if there is equivalence, obviously there will be positive transfer, and that's quite easy. The difficulty lies in partial non-equivalence, or even in complete non-equivalence, where new conceptual representations need to be developed. So we need distinct teaching approaches, focusing on linking L2 forms to concepts that already exist, to focus on restructuring, and to help students develop these concepts. So what? Well, target-like performance in the L2 or LX requires conceptual restructuring. The L2 teaching task is not just to help learners to map meaning to form, but to help them think for speaking in the L2. And cross-linguistic comparisons are crucial, I think, in foreign language classrooms. They promote intercultural competence. So the unexpected final lap may be to learn to think for speaking in a L2. And our famous Brisbicka, she's been cited many times here before, who says, well, it's not impossible, though very difficult, to leave the experiential world of one's native language for that of another language, or stretching the metaphor to the limit, to inhabit two worlds at once. But when one switches from one language to another, it is not just the form that changes, but also the content. And we have had some interesting research showing that bilinguals tell different stories according to the language in which they tell the similar story. So they focus on different aspects of the story. So thank you.